I never thought I'd be sitting here, telling you about the night my heart broke in front of a room full of strangers. My name is Carol, and at 55 I thought I knew what pain was. I'd delivered babies who didn't make it, held dying patients' hands as they slipped away, worked double shifts until my feet bled in worn-out shoes. But nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for the moment my own son looked at me like I was a disease he needed to avoid. You know that feeling when you're so excited about something that you can barely sleep the night before? That's how I felt when Michael called me 3 weeks ago. "Mum," he said, and I could hear something different in his voice, something warmer than usual. "I'm having my birthday dinner at that fancy Italian place downtown Bellicotti. Would you like to come?" I dropped the dish I was washing. My hands were trembling as I said yes, trying not to sound too eager, trying not to let him hear the tears in my voice. My son, my beautiful boy who I'd raised alone after his father walked out when he was 2. The child I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, who I'd cheered for at every soccer game, who I'd stayed up with through every fever and nightmare. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. For 28 years, it had been just us against the world. I was his mother, his cheerleader, his safe place. When he graduated from law school, I was the only one in the audience crying with pride. When he got his first job at that big firm, I was the one who celebrated with him over takeout Chinese food in his tiny apartment. I was there for everything that mattered. But then he met Rebecca. Beautiful, polished Rebecca with her perfect blonde hair and her family's money. Suddenly, my weekly calls turned into monthly ones. Our Sunday dinners became occasional lunches, then awkward coffee meetings, then nothing at all. She never liked me. I could see it in her eyes the first time we met. The way she looked at my discount store clothes, my working-class accent, my hands that were rough from a lifetime of honest work. "Your mother is so ... Simple. I heard her tell him once when she thought I was in the bathroom. Simple. Like being a nurse for 30 years. Like raising a child alone. Like sacrificing everything for love. Was somehow beneath her understanding. But this invitation felt different. Maybe Rebecca was finally ready to accept me. Maybe Michael had realized that blood is thicker than whatever poison she'd been whispering in his ear. Maybe, just maybe, I would finally have the family I'd dreamed of since the day I first held him in my arms. I spent 3 hours getting ready that night. I bought a new dress. Nothing expensive, because my pension doesn't stretch that far, but it was navy blue with little pearl buttons, and it made me feel elegant. I did my hair at the salon for the first time in 2 years, letting Maria work her magic with curls and hairspray until I looked like a woman who belonged in a fancy restaurant. I even bought a gift. It wasn't much. A vintage watch I'd found at an antique shop that reminded me of the one his grandfather used to wear. Michael had loved his grandfather, used to sit on his lap for hours listening to stories about the old country. I thought it would mean something. I thought it would show him that I remembered, that I cared about the little things that connected us to our family history. The restaurant was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and scattered it like stars across white tablecloths. The smell of garlic and fresh bread made my mouth water, and for a moment, I felt like I belonged there. I felt like a woman celebrating her son's birthday, not an outsider hoping for scraps of affection. I arrived 15 minutes early because I wanted everything to be perfect. The hostess smiled at me, a real smile, not the polite kind people give to service workers, and asked if I was meeting someone. "Yes," I said, and my voice was steady and proud. "I'm here for the Morrison party. It's my son's birthday." She led me toward the back of the restaurant, past tables filled with families laughing together, couples holding hands over candlelight, groups of friends sharing stories and wine. Everyone looked so happy, so connected, so loved. Soon, I thought, that would be me. Soon, I would be part of a celebration instead of watching other people live the life I'd always wanted. And then I saw them. Michael was sitting at a large round table, wearing the expensive suit I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago when he made partner. He looked handsome and successful, like the man I'd always known he could become. Rebecca sat beside him in a dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months, her jewelry catching the light with every gesture. But it wasn't just them. The table was full. His law firm colleagues, Rebecca's parents, her sister, and brother-in-law. People I'd never met who were all laughing at some story someone was telling. They looked like they belonged together, like they were a family that had known each other forever. I walked toward them, my heart hammering in my chest, clutching the small wrapped gift in my hand. I'd practiced what I would say, something casual, but warm. Something that wouldn't embarrass him, but would let everyone know how proud I was of the man he'd become. "Hi, sweetheart," I said softly when I reached the table, my voice barely above a whisper, because I didn't want to interrupt their conversation. The entire table went silent. Every fork stopped moving, every conversation died, every smile faded as all eyes turned toward me. Michael's face went white, then red, then something I'd never seen before, cold and distant, like he was looking at a stranger who'd had the audacity to interrupt his perfect evening. "Go sit somewhere else," he said, his voice loud enough for the tables around us to hear. "This table is for family." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my knees go weak, felt the air leave my lungs, felt something essential inside me crack and splinter. The restaurant seemed to spin around me, the chandelier light becoming too bright, the sound of silverware and conversation fading to a distant roar. Family. This table is for family. I wasn't family. The woman who'd given birth to him, who'd raised him alone, who'd sacrificed everything for his future. I wasn't family. But these strangers, these people who'd known him for a few years, they were family. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, feeling every eye in the restaurant on me, hearing the whispers that I was sure were about the crazy old woman who'd crashed a private party. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped his gift. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. For existing? For loving him? For believing that a mother would always have a place at her son's table? I turned around and walked away, my face burning with shame, my legs somehow carrying me even though I felt like I was dying inside. The hostess tried to catch my eye as I passed, but I couldn't look at her. I couldn't look at anyone. I just needed to get out of there before I fell apart completely. But then something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was the memory of my own mother's voice telling me to never let anyone make me feel small. Maybe it was just the stubborn strength that had carried me through 30 years of single motherhood. Whatever it was, I turned around and walked back to the hostess stand. "I'd like a table for one, please," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Somewhere quiet if you have it." The hostess seated me at a small table near the window, far enough from Michael's party that I couldn't hear their laughter, but close enough that I could see them if I turned my head slightly to the left. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. It was like watching a car accident, horrible and painful but impossible to ignore. They were having the time of their lives. Michael was telling animated stories, his hands moving expressively the way they had when he was little and excited about something he'd learned in school. Rebecca's father was patting him on the back like he was already the son-in-law of the year. Her mother was showing him pictures on her phone, probably of some vacation house or family event that I would never be invited to. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a simple pasta dish that still costs more than I usually spent on dinner for a week. The waiter was kind, professional, but I could see the pity in his eyes. He'd witnessed what happened at Michael's table. Everyone in the restaurant had witnessed it. My phone buzzed. A text message from my neighbor, Mrs. Chun. "How's the birthday dinner going? I hope you're having a wonderful time with Michael and his wife." I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed back, "It's lovely. Thank you for asking." The lie came so easily. I'd been protecting Michael's image my whole life, making excuses for his behavior even when it hurt me. Even now, sitting alone at a table meant for one while he celebrated with people who mattered more than I did, I was still protecting him. The pasta arrived, and I tried to eat, but everything tasted like cardboard. I kept thinking about all the birthday dinners we'd shared when he was growing up. The homemade cakes I'd bake from scratch because we couldn't afford bakery ones. The way his eyes would light up when I'd present him with whatever small gift I'd managed to save for. The ritual we had where he'd make a wish, and I'd tell him that whatever he wished for, I hoped it would come true. "I wish we could always be together, Mum," he'd said on his 8th birthday, chocolate frosting smeared across his cheek. "I wish it could always be just you and me." I wondered when that changed. When did I become the embarrassment instead of the blessing? When did my love become a burden instead of a gift? From the corner of my eye, I watched Rebecca's sister lean over and whisper something to Michael. He glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away, his jaw tightening. She was probably asking who I was, and he was probably making up some story about how I was nobody, how I didn't matter, how I was just some confused old woman who'd wandered into the wrong celebration. The worst part wasn't even what he'd said to me. The worst part was seeing how easily he could pretend I didn't exist, how naturally the lies came to him, how comfortable he looked in a world where I had never been born, never sacrificed, never loved him with every breath in my body. I remembered the night I'd worked a double shift at the hospital and came home to find him crying over a math homework problem he couldn't solve. I was exhausted, my feet were killing me, and I had to be back at work in 6 hours. But I sat with him at that little kitchen table until nearly midnight, working through every problem until he understood. "You're the smartest mum in the world," he'd said, falling asleep against my shoulder as I carried him to bed. Where was that boy now? Where was the child who used to tell people proudly that his mum was a nurse, that she helped sick people get better, that she was his hero? The birthday cake arrived at Michael's table, a towering confection with elegant decorations that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Everyone gathered around as the restaurant lights dimmed and the servers began to sing. I watched Michael blow out the candles, watched him laugh as Rebecca fed him a bite of cake, watched him accept congratulations and gifts from people who'd known him for a fraction of the time I had. I thought about the vintage watch in my purse, still wrapped in tissue paper. I'd imagined the moment I would give it to him, how his face would soften when he realized what it was, how he might remember sitting on his grandfather's lap, listening to stories. Now it felt like carrying around evidence of my own foolishness. My waiter appeared beside my table. "How's everything, ma'am? Can I get you anything else?" "Actually," I said, reaching into my purse, "could you do me a favor?" I pulled out the wrapped watch and handed it to him, along with a $20 bill, more than I could afford, but somehow it felt important. "Could you take this to the gentleman at that table? The one in the navy suit. It's his birthday." The waiter looked confused, but nodded. I watched him walk over to Michael's table, watched him lean down and say something quietly, watched him place the gift beside Michael's plate. Everyone at the table turned to look toward me, their faces curious and slightly uncomfortable. Michael picked up the package slowly, unwrapped it with careful fingers. When he saw the watch, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe recognition, possibly even a moment of the tenderness he used to show me. For just a second, he looked like my little boy again. Then Rebecca leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and his expression hardened. He set the watch down without putting it on, without acknowledging me, without even the courtesy of a nod in my direction. He said something to the waiter, who walked back to my table looking embarrassed. "The gentleman asked me to return this to you," the waiter said quietly, holding out the watch. He said, He said he doesn't accept gifts from strangers. Strangers. The word hit me like a slap. 30 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion reduced to a single word. Strangers. I took the watch back with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Thank you," I told the waiter. "You've been very kind." I finished my pasta methodically, chewing each bite carefully, tasting nothing. I paid my check, left a generous tip despite my tight budget, and gathered my purse and coat. As I stood to leave, I allowed myself one last look at Michael's table. He was laughing at something Rebecca's father had said, his arm around Rebecca's shoulders, looking like a man who had everything he'd ever wanted, looking like a man who'd never had a mother who worked herself to the bone to give him opportunities she'd never had, looking like a man who'd been born into privilege instead of love. But as I walked toward the exit, I caught something in his reflection in the restaurant window. For just a moment, when he thought no one was looking, his smile faltered. His hand went to his chest, right over his heart, and he looked empty, lost, like a man who'd traded something precious for something shiny and was just beginning to realize the difference. I stepped out into the cool night air, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe properly. The city hummed around me, cars passing, people walking, life continuing as it always did. I looked up at the stars barely visible through the light pollution and made a silent promise to myself. I would not call him tomorrow to apologize for embarrassing him. I would not send a card explaining myself or making excuses for showing up uninvited to his perfect life. I would not chase after love that had clearly run away from me. Instead, I would remember what my mother taught me long ago, that dignity is something you give yourself, not something others can take away. That respect is earned, but self-respect is chosen. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to force your way into spaces where you're not wanted. I walked to my car with my head held high, the vintage watch still in my purse, a small symbol of all the love I'd given that would never be returned. But as I drove home through empty streets, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't broken. I was hurt, yes. Disappointed, absolutely. But somewhere deep inside, beneath all the pain and humiliation, there was something that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was something stronger than that. It was the quiet certainty that I had loved well, even if that love hadn't been valued. It was the knowledge that I had given everything I had to give, and that was enough, even if it hadn't been enough for him. The weeks that followed felt like walking through quicksand. Every normal day seemed to mock me with its ordinariness. The same morning coffee, the same news programs, the same neighbors waving hello, as if my entire world hadn't shifted off its axis. I kept waiting for Michael to call, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, maybe just to acknowledge that I existed. The call never came. Instead, I found out about his life through cruel accidents. Mrs. Chun mentioned seeing an engagement announcement in the newspaper's society pages. "Such a beautiful couple," she said, showing me the photo over our shared fence. "Your son looks so happy." There they were, Michael and Rebecca, posed in what looked like a magazine spread. The announcement detailed their upcoming wedding at Rebecca's family estate, mentioned the guest lists of prominent business leaders and politicians, described a celebration that would cost more than I'd earned in 5 years. At the bottom, in small print, it listed the families. The bride is the daughter of Richard and Patricia Whitman of Beacon Hill. The groom is the son of the late Robert Morrison. The late Robert Morrison, Michael's father, who'd walked out on us when Michael was 2 years old. The man who'd sent a birthday card twice in 26 years and never contributed a penny to his son's upbringing. He was mentioned, even though he'd been dead for a decade. I wasn't mentioned at all. According to this announcement, Michael had materialized from thin air, raised himself, put himself through school, and become successful entirely through his own efforts. I had been erased from his history as efficiently as if I'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Newspaper announcements were just formalities, just social conventions that didn't reflect real relationships or real love. But when I ran into Michael's old soccer coach at the grocery store, I realized how deep the erasure went. "Carol," Coach Peterson called out, his face lighting up with genuine warmth. "I haven't seen you in forever. How's Michael doing? I heard he's getting married soon." "Yes," I managed, forcing a smile. "He's very happy." "That's wonderful. You know, I still tell people about what an amazing mother you were. All those games you never missed, even when you were working double shifts. The way you'd bring orange slices for the whole team because you wanted every kid to feel special. Michael was so lucky to have you." The past tense hit me like a brick. Had been. As if I were dead, as if that part of his life was over and finished. "I keep meaning to call him," Coach Peterson continued. "Give me his number, and I'll tell him I ran into you." I bet he'd love to hear from his old coach. I gave him the number, but I knew Michael wouldn't appreciate the contact. In his new life, his old coach was probably as unwelcome as his old mother reminders of a past he apparently decided wasn't good enough for his present. 3 days later, Coach Peterson called me, his voice confused and hurt. "Carol, I called Michael like you suggested, but it was the strangest thing. When I mentioned that I'd seen you and how proud you must be of his success, he got very quiet. Then he said he'd rather not discuss his family situation and changed the subject." "Did something happen between you two?" I made up some story about a minor disagreement. Nothing serious. Just one of those family things that would blow over soon. I'd become so good at lying to protect Michael's image that I barely recognized myself anymore. Even when he was treating me like a stranger, I was still covering for him, still making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. The real blow came 2 weeks later when I received an invitation in the mail, not to the wedding, but to Michael's law firm's annual charity gala. It was one of those mass mailings they sent to potential donors, people with money who might contribute to their chosen cause. My name was on their mailing list not because I was Michael's mother, but because I'd made a small donation years ago when he first started working there. I almost threw it away. What was the point of torturing myself by attending an event where I'd be surrounded by Michael's colleagues and friends, all of whom knew nothing about me? But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the stubborn part of me that refused to disappear completely from his life. I bought a ticket with money I couldn't afford and spent more money I didn't have on a dress that would help me blend in with the other donors. I told myself I wouldn't approach him, wouldn't embarrass him, wouldn't do anything except observe from a distance the life he'd built without me. The gala was held at the city's most expensive hotel, in a ballroom that sparkled with crystal and gold. I felt like an imposter the moment I walked in, but I held my head high and found a quiet corner where I could watch without being noticed. Michael was in his element, moving through the crowd with confidence and charm, introducing Rebecca to colleagues and clients as if she were the greatest achievement of his career. She looked stunning in a designer gown that probably cost more than my monthly pension, her diamond engagement ring catching the light with every gesture. I watched him give a speech about the importance of giving back to the community, about how success meant nothing if you didn't use it to help others. The irony was so sharp it almost made me laugh. Here was my son, talking about helping people in need, while the woman who'd sacrificed everything to ensure his success stood invisible in the back of the room. During the cocktail hour, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Rebecca was talking to a group of wives, their voices carrying over the classical music and clinking glasses. Michael's had such an interesting journey, she was saying, her tone suggesting she was sharing something slightly scandalous, rising from such humble beginnings. His mother was just a nurse, working class. He's worked so hard to overcome that background. Overcome, as if loving him had been an obstacle to his success instead of the foundation that made it possible. How brave of him, one of the other women murmured. And how lucky that he found you to help him navigate real society. Well, Rebecca laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We can't choose our origins, but we can choose our future. Michael understands that now. I felt physically sick, not just because of what she'd said, but because Michael was standing right there, nodding along, saying nothing to defend me or correct her casual dismissal of everything I'd meant to him. That's when I realized the full scope of what I'd lost. It wasn't just that Michael had chosen Rebecca over me, it was that he'd chosen her version of reality over the truth of our history together. In his mind, I hadn't been the mother who'd loved him unconditionally. I'd been the embarrassing beginning he'd had to overcome to reach his true destination. I left the gala early, before the dinner was served, before the awards were given, before I could hear any more conversations about Michael's unfortunate past and fortunate future. As I waited for the valet to bring my modest car to the front of the hotel, the same car I'd driven him to school in, to soccer practice, to his high school graduation, I saw Michael through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was laughing at something someone had said, his arm around Rebecca's waist, looking like a man without a care in the world. But as I watched, he turned slightly toward the window, and for just a moment, our eyes met across the glass and distance. I saw something flicker across his face, surprise, maybe guilt, possibly recognition of what he'd become. But then Rebecca pulled him back into the conversation, and the moment was gone, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk while my car pulled up, driven by a valet who was probably younger than Michael and certainly kinder. As I drove home through empty streets, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to keep chasing after someone who was running away from me. I wasn't going to keep trying to fit into a life that had no room for me. I wasn't going to keep breaking my own heart by hoping for love from someone who'd decided I wasn't worth loving. But I also wasn't going to disappear. I wasn't going to let his rejection define my worth or determine my future. I'd raised a son who'd become successful and accomplished, even if he'd also become cruel and ungrateful. I had spent 30 years caring for sick people, bringing comfort to families in their darkest hours, making a difference in ways that couldn't be measured in salary or social status. I had lived a life of meaning, even if the person who should have valued it most had chosen not to see it. The months that followed became a masterclass in loneliness. I learned the difference between being alone and being abandoned, between solitude and exile. Being alone was what I'd chosen on quiet Sunday mornings when I'd read with a cup of tea. Being abandoned was sitting at my kitchen table on Michael's birthday, staring at the phone that never rang, holding a card I'd written but would never send. I stopped mentioning him to neighbors and friends. When people asked about my son, I'd smile and say he was doing well, then quickly change the subject. It was easier than explaining that I'd somehow become a stranger to the person I'd loved most in the world. It was simpler than admitting that all those years of sacrifice had led to this, a silence so complete it felt like death. The worst part wasn't the special occasions, birthdays, holidays, Mother's Day. I'd learned to expect nothing on those days, had trained myself to treat them like any other day on the calendar. The worst part was the ordinary moments when muscle memory kicked in and I'd reach for my phone to call him about something small and meaningless before remembering that I no longer had that right. When I saw a news story about a case similar to one he'd mentioned working on years ago, my first instinct was to call and ask if he'd been following it. When I found a recipe for the chocolate chip cookies he'd loved as a child, I actually started making a double batch before remembering that there was no one to share them with. When I passed his old elementary school and saw children playing in the same playground where he'd learnt to swing and climb, I wanted to tell someone about the time he'd fallen and scraped his knee so badly that I'd had to leave work early to take him to the emergency room. But there was no one to tell these stories to anymore. No one who cared about the little boy he'd been, or understood why these memories mattered. I'd become the sole keeper of his childhood, the only witness to the love that had shaped him, and he'd made it clear that this history was unwelcome in his present. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching basic first aid classes to anyone who wanted to learn. It gave me purpose, reminded me that my years of nursing experience still had value, even if my years of mothering apparently didn't. The people who attended my classes were grateful for my knowledge, respectful of my expertise, and kind in ways that made me remember what it felt like to be valued. One evening, after a particularly successful class where I'd taught a group of new parents how to handle childhood emergencies, one of the mothers approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you so much," she said, holding her infant daughter close to her chest. "You've given me confidence that I can keep her safe. You must be an amazing mother yourself." I almost broke down right there in the community center's fluorescent-lit classroom. "Thank you," I managed to whisper. "That means more than you know." But as I drove home that night, I realized something that both comforted and devastated me. I had been an amazing mother. I'd been patient when he was difficult, encouraging when he was discouraged, proud when he succeeded, and forgiving when he failed. I'd attended every school play, every soccer game, every graduation ceremony. I'd celebrated his victories and mourned his defeats as if they were my own. The failure wasn't mine. I hadn't failed as a mother. He'd failed as a son. But somehow, in the twisted logic of maternal love, that realization hurt even more than blaming myself had. Christmas was approaching, and I found myself dreading it for the first time in my adult life. I'd always loved the holidays, the lights, the music, the excuse to spoil Michael with gifts I'd saved for all year. Even after he'd grown up and moved out, Christmas had remained our tradition, our annual reunion where we'd temporarily reclaim the closeness we'd shared when he was small. Last year, before Rebecca had fully poised the well, Michael had still come for Christmas dinner. It had been awkward, strained, with him checking his phone constantly and leaving early to attend some party with Rebecca's friends. But he'd come. He'd eaten the ham I'd cooked the way he liked it, had smiled when I gave him the sweater I'd knitted during long winter evenings, had even hugged me goodbye, though it felt more like obligation than affection. This year I knew better than to expect anything. I didn't buy a tree, didn't hang stockings, didn't even put up the decorations we'd accumulated over the years. Instead, I sat in my living room on Christmas Eve, surrounded by the silence of my own making, watching old movies and trying to pretend it was just another day. But loneliness has a way of amplifying every sound, every absence, every reminder of what used to be. I could hear families next door laughing over dinner, could see the glow of Christmas lights through my curtains, could smell the turkey Mrs. Chun was cooking for her children and grandchildren, who'd driven from 3 states away to be with her. That's when I did something I swore I wouldn't do. I drove past Michael's house. I told myself I was just taking a longer route to the grocery store, but I knew I was lying. I wanted to see if his lights were on, if there were cars in the driveway, if he was hosting the kind of Christmas celebration I'd always imagined we'd have someday when he had a family of his own. The house was blazing with light, decorated with the kind of professional holiday display that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Cars lined the circular driveway, expensive cars, luxury sedans, vehicles that probably cost more than I'd earned in my entire career. Through the large front windows, I could see elegantly dressed people moving about with champagne glasses, could hear the faint sound of laughter and classical music. I parked across the street and sat in my car like a stalker, watching my son host a party where I would never be welcome. He appeared in the window briefly, wearing a burgundy sweater I'd never seen before, looking handsome and successful and completely at ease in a world that had no room for the woman who'd given him life. Rebecca joined him at the window, and he put his arm around her waist with easy familiarity. She was wearing what looked like a designer dress and pearls that caught the light every time she moved. They looked like they belonged together, like they'd been born into this kind of life instead of building it from nothing. As I watched, Rebecca said something that made Michael laugh, and he kissed her temple with the kind of casual affection that used to be mine alone. They looked like the perfect couple living the perfect life in their perfect house, surrounded by perfect friends who'd never had to worry about whether they could afford to heat their homes or fix their cars when they broke down. I was about to drive away when something stopped me. Michael had moved closer to the window, and in the glow of the Christmas lights, I could see his face more clearly. He was smiling, laughing at appropriate moments, playing the role of the gracious host with practiced ease. But there was something in his eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to have nightmares, who would climb into my bed in the middle of the night because he was afraid of the dark. He looked empty. Successful, wealthy, socially accomplished, but fundamentally empty. Like a man who'd gotten everything he thought he wanted and was beginning to realize it wasn't enough. I sat there in my car watching my son's perfect life, and for the first time since that horrible night at the restaurant, I felt something other than pain or anger or desperate love. I felt something that surprised me with its clarity and strength. I felt sorry for him, not the pitying kind of sorry that looks down on someone's weakness, but the deep, maternal sorry that mourns what a child has lost without even knowing it. Michael had traded authenticity for acceptance, love for luxury, substance for status. He'd won everything he thought he wanted and lost everything that actually mattered. As I finally drove away from his glowing house and perfect party, I realized something that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. I didn't want to trade places with him. Yes, he had money and status and social approval, but I had something he'd given up. I had the ability to love without conditions, to value people for who they were instead of what they could do for me, to find meaning in service instead of success. He'd broken my heart. But he'd also freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from someone who'd forgotten how to give it. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe fully, like I could imagine a future that didn't revolve around waiting for his call or hoping for his approval. But I still had something that belonged to him. Something he'd left behind when he decided I wasn't worth keeping. All the love I'd given him over the years. All the memories of who he used to be. All the pride I'd felt watching him grow into the man I thought he'd become. That love was mine now. He couldn't take it back or make it disappear or pretend it had never existed. It was proof that I'd lived fully, loved completely, and given everything I had to give, even if he didn't want it anymore. It had made me who I was, and I was finally beginning to remember that the woman I'd become was worth loving, even if my son had forgotten how. The new year brought something I hadn't expected. Clarity. Not the kind that comes from sudden revelation, but the slow, steady kind that builds like sunrise. So gradual you don't notice it until you realize you can see everything clearly for the first time in months. I stopped checking the newspaper for mentions of Michael's law firm. I stopped driving past places where we used to go together, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man he'd become. I stopped composing letters in my head that I'd never send, explanations and apologies for crimes I'd never committed. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for him to remember that he had a mother who loved him. Instead, I started remembering who I was before I became Michael's mother, and who I still was, now that he'd decided I wasn't worth keeping. I was Carol Henderson Morrison. A woman who'd put herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs and caring for her own sick mother. I was someone who'd delivered over 1,000 babies during my career, who'd held dying patients' hands and helped their families find peace in their final moments. I was a woman who'd raised a son alone with such love and dedication that he'd grown up to become everything I'd dreamed he could. Be successful, accomplished, confident. The fact that he'd also become cruel and ungrateful didn't erase the good I'd done. It just meant that somewhere along the way, he'd chosen to forget the lessons about kindness and loyalty that I'd tried so hard to teach him. I began attending a book club at the local library, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when I was working and raising Michael. The other members were mostly women my age, some widowed, some divorced, some never married. All of us discovering that life after 50 could be rich and meaningful in ways we'd never expected. You have such interesting perspectives on the characters, Eleanor. The group's organizer told me after we'd finished discussing a novel about a woman starting over after her husband's death. You understand people in a way that suggests you've really lived, really experienced loss and recovery. I thanked her, but inside I was thinking about how strange it was that my greatest loss, losing Michael's love, was teaching me things about myself I'd never known. I was discovering that I was stronger than I'd thought, more resilient than I'd imagined, more valuable than I'd been led to believe. The book club ladies started inviting me to other activities, museum visits, lectures at the community college, coffee dates, where we'd discuss everything from politics to grandchildren to the peculiar challenges of aging in a world that seemed designed for younger people. For the first time in years, I had friends who knew me as Carol, not as Michael's mother or the nurse from the cardiac ward. They liked me for my own wit, my own insights, my own company. It was during one of these coffee dates that Martha, a retired teacher whose own daughter lived across the country and rarely called, said something that stopped me cold. "You know what I've learnt?" she said, stirring cream into her coffee with the deliberate movements of someone choosing her words carefully. The children who forget their parents' sacrifices are usually the ones who most needed to forget them. It's too painful for them to remember what love looks like when they've chosen to live without it. She wasn't talking about Michael specifically. Martha didn't even know the full extent of what had happened between us. But her words hit me with the force of truth I'd been avoiding for months. Michael hadn't erased me from his life because I was embarrassing or inadequate. He'd erased me because remembering my love would make it impossible for him to live the shallow, status-obsessed life he'd chosen with Rebecca. Every time he looked at me, he was forced to confront the difference between authentic love and the transactional relationships that now defined his world. That night, I went through the boxes of Michael's childhood things I'd kept stored in my closet report cards covered in gold stars, photographs from soccer games and school plays, the letter he'd written me for Mother's Day when he was 12, telling me I was the best mum in the world and promising he'd always take care of me when I got old. I didn't throw these things away, but I didn't put them back in the closet either. Instead, I created a memory box, a beautiful wooden chest I found at an antique store, and I placed everything inside with the care of someone creating a time capsule. These weren't shrines to my own pain anymore. They were evidence of love that had been real and true and transformative, even if it was no longer wanted. On the top of everything, I placed a letter I wrote to the little boy Michael had been. "My dearest son, I want you to know that loving you was the greatest privilege of my life. Watching you grow from a curious toddler into a confident young man was like witnessing a miracle every single day. You were funny and smart and kind, and you made me proud in ways I never knew were possible. I don't know what happened to that beautiful boy, but I will always be grateful that I got to be his mother. Love always, Mum." I sealed the box and put it in the back of my bedroom closet. Not hidden, but not displayed either. It was my own private museum of the best years of my life, and whether Michael ever wanted to see it again didn't matter. It was mine now, proof that I had loved completely and been loved in return, even if that love had later been forgotten. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected phone call that would change everything. I was in my garden, planting the tomatoes and herbs that would feed me through the summer, when my cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer it anyway. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Dr. Sarah Patel from St. Mary's Hospital. I hope you don't mind me calling you at home, but I wanted to speak with you about something rather urgent." My heart immediately went to Michael. Had something happened to him? Was he hurt? Sick? In trouble? Despite everything, the maternal instinct to protect him was still so strong that I nearly dropped my phone. "Is it my son?" I asked, my voice barely steady. No, nothing like that," Dr. Patel assured me quickly. "I'm calling because we have a situation here at the hospital, and we desperately need someone with your experience and expertise. I know you retired a few years ago, but your reputation preceded you. Everyone I've spoken to says you were one of the best nurses this city has ever seen." She explained that the hospital was facing a crisis. A flu outbreak had left them critically short-staffed in the cardiac unit, and they had several complex cases that required the kind of experienced care that new nurses couldn't provide. They were willing to offer me a temporary contract at a higher hourly rate than I'd ever earned, with the flexibility to work whatever hours I felt comfortable with. "I understand if you're not interested in coming back," Dr. Patel continued. "Retirement is meant to be enjoyed, and healthcare is more demanding than ever. But if you'd be willing to consider it, even for just a few weeks, you'd literally be saving lives." Saving lives. The phrase echoed in my mind as I looked around my small garden, at the quiet suburban street where my days had been passing in peaceful but unremarkable succession. I'd been finding contentment in my new routines, but I hadn't been finding purpose. I'd been healing from the loss of Michael's love, but I hadn't been using the gifts and experience that had defined me for 30 years. "When do you need an answer?" I asked. "Honestly, we need help starting tomorrow if possible, but I understand if you need time to think about it." I looked down at my hands. Still strong despite my age, still steady despite everything they'd been through. These hands had delivered babies, started IVS in impossible veins, performed CPR that had brought people back from the edge of death. These hands had work to do, and it had nothing to do with whether my son thought I was worth loving. "I'll be there tomorrow morning at 7, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Really? That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Mrs. Morrison. You have no idea what this means to us, but I did know what it meant. It meant that, while Michael had been busy erasing me from his life, the world still had a place for me. It meant that my years of experience and dedication still had value, even if my years of mothering apparently didn't. It meant that I could still save lives, still make a difference, still matter in ways that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. That evening, I pressed my old scrubs, checked that my nursing license was still current, and went to bed early like I had before every important shift for 30 years. But this time felt different. This time I wasn't just going to work to support Michael's future or pay for his dreams. This time I was going to work for myself, to use my gifts, to be the woman I'd always been underneath the role of devoted mother. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something that filled me with quiet pride. Michael had taught me to doubt my worth as a mother, but he couldn't touch my worth as a nurse, as a woman, as a human being who had skills and knowledge and compassion to offer the world. He'd tried to make me disappear, but tomorrow I would reappear in the place where I'd always belong, at the bedside of people who needed healing, using the gifts I'd spent a lifetime developing to serve purposes bigger than his approval or disapproval. It wasn't revenge. It was something better than that. It was remembering who I was before I became his mother, and choosing to be that person again, whether he ever recognized her worth or not. Walking back into St. Mary's Hospital felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey. The familiar sounds, monitors beeping, pages over the intercom, the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors created a symphony I'd forgotten I missed. The smell of antiseptic and floor wax that most people found sterile and unwelcoming wrapped around me like a comfortable old blanket. Dr. Patel met me at the nurse's station, her relief visible as she shook my hand. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you again for coming back. I can't tell you how much we need you here." The cardiac unit was exactly as I remembered it, but the staff was almost entirely new. Young nurses who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone handle the complex medication regimens and delicate monitoring that cardiac patients required. They were competent enough, but they moved with the careful uncertainty of people still learning to trust their own judgment. "Don't worry about easing back in, Doctor," Patel said as she walked me through the unit. "We're throwing you straight into the deep end. Room 314 has been our most challenging case. Mr. Henderson came in 3 days ago with acute heart failure, and he's been difficult. He's refusing most of his medications, won't cooperate with physical therapy, and yesterday he made 2 of our newest nurses cry." I smiled, remembering countless similar cases from my career. "Let me guess, he's scared, in pain, and feeling like he's lost control of his own body, so he's trying to control the only thing he can, how much he cooperates with treatment." "Exactly. His family is at their wits' end. His daughter flew in from Seattle, and she's been here around the clock trying to convince him to follow doctor's orders. Would you mind taking him as your primary patient?" I accepted the assignment without hesitation, but as I read through Mr. Henderson's chart, something made my breath catch. His daughter's name was listed as his emergency contact, Rebecca Henderson. It couldn't be the same Rebecca, could it? Henderson wasn't an uncommon name, and Rebecca was certainly popular enough. But as I walked toward room 314, preparing to meet my new patient, I heard a voice I recognized coming from inside. "Daddy, you have to take your medications. The doctor says if you don't follow the treatment plan, you could have another episode. Please, just try to cooperate." I stopped outside the door, my heart hammering as I recognized Rebecca's voice, strained with exhaustion and worry. Through the partially open door, I could see her sitting beside the bed, holding the hand of a man who looked pale and tired but stubbornly defiant. This was Michael's Rebecca. The woman who'd dismissed me as something he'd had to overcome was sitting in that room, desperate for someone to help save her father's life. The woman who'd erased me from Michael's history was about to become my patient's daughter. For a moment, I considered asking Dr. Patel to reassign me to a different patient. It would be easier, less complicated, certainly less emotionally charged. But then I looked at Mr. Henderson's chart again, saw the notes about his deteriorating condition and his family's increasing desperation, and I knew I couldn't walk away. This wasn't about Rebecca or Michael or the pain they'd caused me. This was about a sick man who needed care and a daughter who was watching her father suffer. Personal feelings had no place in medical care. I'd learned that lesson 30 years ago during my first week as a nurse. I knocked gently on the doorframe and stepped into the room. Good morning. I'm Carol, and I'll be your father's nurse today. Rebecca looked up, and I watched the recognition dawn on her face like a slow-motion car crash. Her perfectly composed expression crumbled into shock, then confusion, then something that might have been guilt or fear. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words. Mr. Henderson, oblivious to the drama playing out between his daughter and his new nurse, looked at me with the suspicious scowl of a man who'd been poked and prodded by too many medical professionals in the past few days. Another one, he grumbled. How old are you, 12? I told the last one I don't want any more nurses who looked like they should be in high school. I smiled, grateful that his cantankerous attitude gave me something concrete to focus on. I'm 55, Mr. Henderson, and I've been taking care of cardiac patients for 30 years. Would you like to see my nursing license to verify my qualifications? Something in my tone must have convinced him that I wasn't going to be intimidated by his bluster. He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded grudgingly. At least you look like you know what you're doing. I do know what I'm doing, I said, moving to check his monitors with the efficient confidence that comes from decades of experience. And what I'm doing right now is figuring out why a man who survived 73 years of life is suddenly deciding he doesn't want to see 74. Rebecca had remained silent during this exchange, but I could feel her watching me, probably trying to figure out what to say or do. I ignored her presence as much as possible, focusing entirely on her father, who was already responding to being treated like an adult instead of a child. The pills make me feel worse, he said, his voice losing some of its antagonistic edge. I can't think straight, can't eat, can't sleep. What's the point of living longer if I feel terrible every day? It was a complaint I'd heard hundreds of times before, and I knew exactly how to address it. I spent the next 20 minutes talking him through each medication, explaining what it did, why it was necessary, and how we could adjust timing and dosages to minimize side effects. I showed him how to monitor his own symptoms so he could feel more in control of his treatment. By the time I finished his morning care routine, Mr. Henderson was not only cooperating but actually asking questions about his condition and treatment plan. The difference in his demeanor was remarkable, from sullen and defiant to engaged and hopeful. Carol, he said as I prepared to check on other patients, would you mind if I asked you to be my nurse again tomorrow? You're the first person who's talked to me like I have a brain in my head instead of just a broken heart. I'd be honored to take care of you again, Mr. Henderson, I said, and I meant it completely. It wasn't until I was leaving the room that Rebecca finally found her voice. Excuse me, she said quietly, following me into the hallway. Could I speak with you privately for a moment? I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since that awful night at the restaurant. She looked tired, stressed, younger somehow without her usual perfect makeup and designer clothes. She was wearing jeans and a wrinkled blouse, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her eyes red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep, or both. Of course, I said, leading her to a quiet alcove near the nurse's station. I don't know what to say, she began, her voice shaking slightly. I had no idea you worked here. I didn't know you were a nurse. There are a lot of things about me you don't know, I said calmly. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. My father, he's all I have left. My mother died 5 years ago, and I'm an only child. He's been so stubborn about his treatment, and I've been so scared, double, quotes her voice broke, and I saw tears threatening to spill over. Despite everything she'd done to me, despite the casual cruelty with which she'd dismissed my significance in Michael's life, I felt my professional compassion kick in. This was a daughter terrified of losing her father, and I knew that fear intimately. Your father's going to be fine, I said, my voice gentle but professional. His condition is serious but manageable. He just needed someone to treat him with respect and explain things in a way he could understand. Many patients become difficult when they feel helpless or confused about their treatment. Rebecca nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Thank you. I can see that he trusts you already, and that's more than anyone else has accomplished since he's been here. We stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history hanging between us like a wall neither of us knew how to climb. Rebecca, I said finally, I want you to know that whatever happened between Michael and me, has nothing to do with your father's care. I'm here as a nurse, not as anyone connected to your personal life. Your father will receive the best care I can give him, and you don't need to worry about anything else. Relief flooded her face, followed quickly by something that looked like shame. Carol, about that night at the restaurant, and the things I said at the gala. I know I was. It doesn't matter now, I interrupted gently, but firmly. What matters is your father's recovery. Everything else is in the past. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Standing there in that hospital hallway, watching Rebecca struggle with her fear and guilt, I realized that this unexpected meeting wasn't just coincidence. Sometimes life has a way of bringing us full circle, of giving us opportunities to choose who we want to be when we're tested. Rebecca had hurt me deeply, had been complicit in my erasure from Michael's life, but she was also a daughter who loved her father and was terrified of losing him. And I was a nurse who'd dedicated her life to healing, to helping families through their darkest moments. I could choose to be the bigger person, not because she deserved my kindness, but because being kind was who I'd always been, even when it hadn't been appreciated or returned. I'll see you tomorrow, I told her. Try to get some rest tonight. Your father is going to need you to be strong for the weeks ahead. As I walked away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother and everything to do with being myself. The next few days fell into a rhythm that felt both familiar and surreal. I would arrive at the hospital each morning to find Rebecca already in her father's room, having spent the night in the uncomfortable reclining chair that the hospital provided for family members. She never left except to go home and shower, and even then she was back within an hour. Terrified that something might happen while she was away, Mr. Henderson's condition improved steadily under my care. His medications were adjusted to minimize side effects, his physical therapy sessions became productive rather than combative, and his outlook shifted from resigned despair to cautious optimism. He began asking questions about his discharge plan, about what he'd need to do at home to prevent another episode, about whether he'd be able to resume his daily walks in the park near his apartment. You've worked miracles with him, Dr. Patel told me during one of our morning rounds. His daughter told me yesterday that this is the first time she's seen him smile since before his heart attack. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. What I was doing was simply treating him like a human being instead of a collection of symptoms. I listened when he talked about missing his late wife, acknowledged his fear about becoming a burden to Rebecca, validated his frustration with the limitations his heart condition imposed on his independence. I gave him back his dignity by involving him in decisions about his care instead of just doing things to him. But the real test came on Thursday morning when I walked into his room to find not just Rebecca but Michael sitting beside the bed, looking uncomfortable and out of place in his expensive suit amid the clinical surroundings of the cardiac unit. He was holding Rebecca's hand and speaking in low, soothing tones about how everything would be fine, how they'd hire the best home care nurses, how money was no object when it came to her father's recovery. He looked every inch the successful attorney, the devoted fiancé, the man who had everything under control, until he saw me. The color drained from his face so completely I was momentarily concerned about his own cardiac health. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. Rebecca squeezed his hand and said something about how wonderful I'd been, how much her father liked me, how grateful she was that I was taking such good care of him. Mr. Henderson, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, smiled when he saw me. Carol, there's my favorite nurse. Michael, this is the woman I was telling you about. She's the reason I'm feeling human again instead of like some broken machine they're trying to fix. I watched Michael struggle to process what was happening. His eyes moved from me to Rebecca to her father and back again, trying to make sense of a reality that didn't fit with the version of his life he'd constructed. In his world, I was supposed to have disappeared after he dismissed me, not reappeared as the skilled professional caring for his fiancé's father. Hello, Michael, I said calmly, my voice steady and professional. I didn't know you'd be visiting today. What are you doing here? He stammered, his usual eloquence completely abandoning him. I'm working, I said simply. I'm your father-in-law's nurse. The term father-in-law seemed to hit him like a physical blow. It emphasized the connection, the family relationship that meant I would now be part of his life, whether he wanted me there or not. Rebecca's father would be his father-in-law, and I was the person keeping Rebecca's father alive. Rebecca looked between us, clearly sensing the tension, but not fully understanding its source. Michael, This is Carol Morrison. She's the nurse I was telling you about, the one who's been so wonderful with Daddy." "Morrison," Michael repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mr. Henderson chimed in cheerfully. "Carol Morrison. Isn't that interesting? Same last name as yours, Michael. What are the odds?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Rebecca's mind working, putting pieces together, remembering conversations about Michael's background, about his mother who was just a nurse that he'd had to overcome. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, shock, and finally something that looked like horror as she understood exactly who I was and what this meant. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. You're Michael's single quotes, double quotes mother." I finished for her, my voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Yes, I'm Michael's mother." Mr. Henderson looked delighted by this revelation. "Well, isn't this wonderful? What a small world. Carol, you never mentioned you had a son. And Michael, you never told me your mother was a nurse. How perfect that she's the one taking such good care of me." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The woman Michael had dismissed as an embarrassment from his past was now the person his future father-in-law depended on for his life and recovery. The mother he'd erased from his history was now integral to his fiancée's family story. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. "Rebecca, could I speak with you outside for a moment?" Rebecca nodded mutely, still staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. They left the room together, and I could hear their voices in the hallway. Michael's urgent and defensive, Rebecca's shocked and increasingly angry. "Why didn't you tell me your mother was a nurse?" I heard Rebecca ask. "Why didn't you tell me she worked at this hospital?" "I didn't know she worked here," Michael said, his voice rising slightly. "I thought she was retired." "I haven't. We haven't spoken in months." "Months? You haven't spoken to your mother in months? Michael, what is wrong with you?" Mr. Henderson was watching me carefully during this exchange, his expression thoughtful. "Carol," he said quietly, "is everything all right? There seems to be some tension between you and that young man." I smiled at him, grateful for his concern but not wanting to burden him with family drama during his recovery. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Mr. Henderson. Sometimes families go through difficult periods. The important thing is your health and getting you ready to go home." But Mr. Henderson was sharper than I'd given him credit for. "That's your son out there, isn't it? The one who's marrying my Rebecca?" I nodded, seeing no point in denying what was now obvious. "And he's been treating you poorly," he continued, his voice taking on the protective tone of a father who'd recognized a threat to someone he cared about. "Mr. Henderson," I said gently, "please don't concern yourself with this. It's between Michael and me, and it has nothing to do with your care or your daughter's happiness." "Like hell it doesn't," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it since his admission. "Carol, you've been kinder to me in 4 days than some people are in a lifetime. You've treated me with respect and dignity when I was at my worst. You've given my daughter hope when she was terrified of losing me. And you're telling me that my future son-in-law doesn't appreciate having you as a mother." The conversation in the hallway was getting louder, and I could hear Rebecca's voice becoming more distressed. "I don't understand, Michael. She's wonderful. She's professional and kind and competent. She's literally saving my father's life. And you're acting like she's some kind of problem. You don't understand," Michael was saying, his voice defensive and desperate. "It's complicated. She doesn't fit with our life, Rebecca. She doesn't understand our world. Our world." Rebecca's voice was sharp now, cutting. "What world is that, Michael? The world where we're too good for the people who love us. The world where we judge people by their bank accounts instead of their character." I closed my eyes, feeling sorry for all of them. For Rebecca discovering that the man she loved was capable of this kind of cruelty. For Michael realizing that his carefully constructed image was crumbling. For Mr. Henderson, who was witnessing this ugly family drama during what should have been a time of healing and hope. When they returned to the room several minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. Rebecca's eyes were red and angry, and Michael looked like a man who'd just been forced to confront truths about himself that he'd been avoiding for months. "Carol," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology, not just for today, but for everything. The things I said, the way I treated you, the way I influenced Michael to treat you. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Michael stood beside her, his face pale and stricken, saying nothing. He couldn't seem to look directly at me, couldn't seem to find words for a situation that all his legal training hadn't prepared him for. Mr. Henderson was watching this drama unfold with the keen interest of someone who was finally understanding the full scope of what had been happening around him. Michael, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize character when he saw it. I think you need to sit down and have a conversation with your mother. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command from a man who just realized that his future son-in-law had been treating the woman who'd saved his life with inexcusable disrespect. And for the first time since that horrible night at the restaurant, Michael had no choice but to listen. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Michael sat in the visitor's chair, his expensive suit wrinkled and his confident posture collapsed into something that looked almost like the scared little boy I remembered from thunderstorms and bad dreams. Rebecca stood by the window, her arms crossed, watching him with an expression that had shifted from love to disappointment to something approaching disgust. Mr. Henderson had positioned himself as the unofficial moderator of this family tribunal. And despite being the patient in a hospital bed, he somehow commanded the room with the quiet authority of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize truth when he heard it. Michael, he said, his voice gentle but firm, I'd like you to explain to me how a man raised by a woman like Carol could grow up to treat her the way you apparently have. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Michael opened his mouth several times, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that could justify the unjustifiable. He began, then stopped. It's not. I mean, she doesn't understand. He tried again, but each attempt at explanation died before it could become a complete thought. She doesn't understand what? Rebecca asked, her voice sharp with a pain I recognized. The pain of discovering that someone you love is not who you thought they were. She doesn't understand love, sacrifice, hard work. Because from what I've seen, she understands all of those things better than most people. I found myself in the strange position of wanting to comfort the very people who'd hurt me. Rebecca was learning something devastating about the man she'd planned to marry. Michael was being forced to confront the ugliness of choices he'd made. Even Mr. Henderson looked sad, as if he'd hoped for better from the man his daughter loved. Michael, I said quietly, speaking directly to him for the first time since this confrontation began, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. You made your choice months ago when you told me I wasn't family. I accepted that choice, and I moved on with my life. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that reminded me of the boy who used to apologize after arguments by bringing me dandelions he'd picked from the yard. Mum, he said, and his voice cracked on the word like it was rusty from disuse. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt you like this. But you did mean it, I said. Not unkindly, but truthfully. You meant it when you told me to sit somewhere else at the restaurant. You meant it when you returned my birthday gift. You meant it when you erased me from your engagement announcement. Those weren't accidents, Michael. Those were choices. Rebecca was staring at him now with undisguised horror. You returned her gift? Michael, what kind of person returns a gift from their mother? You don't understand, Michael said desperately, turning to Rebecca as if she could somehow save him from this reckoning. My childhood wasn't like yours. We didn't have money. We didn't have connections. We didn't have the advantages that matter in the real world. I worked so hard to build something better, to create a life where I could be respected and successful and double quotes, and you thought I was holding you back from that. I finished for him, finally understanding the full scope of his betrayal. You thought my love was a burden instead of a gift. You thought my working-class background was something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael's face was flushed with shame, but he couldn't deny what I'd said because we all knew it was true. Mr. Henderson shook his head slowly, his expression disappointed but not surprised. Michael, I've lived 73 years, and I've learned something important. A man who's ashamed of where he came from will never be comfortable with where he's going. A man who can't honor the people who loved him first won't know how to honor the people who love him now. Rebecca was crying now, quiet tears that spoke of dreams dying and futures reshaping themselves in real time. Michael, how could you? How could you treat her this way? She's your mother. She raised you alone, sacrificed everything for you, and you repaid her by pretending she didn't exist. Rebecca, please, Michael said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away from him. No, she said, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it. Don't touch me right now. I need to understand who I've been planning to marry. I need to understand what kind of man treats his mother like a stranger. I watched this drama unfold with a mixture of sadness and something I couldn't quite name, not satisfaction. Exactly, but a sense that truth was finally being spoken in places where lies had lived for too long. Rebecca, I said gently, this doesn't have to change anything between you and Michael. People make mistakes, especially when they're trying to build new lives. What matters is whether they can learn from those mistakes and choose differently going forward. But even as I said it, I could see that something fundamental had shifted in Rebecca's perception of Michael. She was seeing him clearly for the first time, and what she saw was a man capable of cruelty to the person who'd loved him most selflessly. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain, "this changes everything. Because if he can treat you this way, you who gave him everything, then how will he treat me when things get difficult? How will he treat our children if they disappoint him? How will he treat anyone who doesn't serve his image of success?" Michael looked panicked now, realizing that his rejection of me was costing him more than just a mother's love. "Rebecca, that's not fair. You can't judge our entire relationship based on this one situation. This one situation, Mr. Henderson's voice was sharp now, protective. "Son, this isn't one situation. This is who you are. This is how you treat people when you think you don't need them anymore." I stood up then, feeling suddenly exhausted by the weight of all this emotion and drama. "I think I should check on my other patients," I said. "Mr. Henderson, your evening medications will be ready in about an hour." "Carol," Mr. Henderson called as I reached the door. "Thank you. Not just for the medical care, but for showing my daughter what real character looks like. She needed to see the difference between someone who's genuinely good and someone who's just good at pretending." I nodded and left them to work through whatever came next. As I walked down the hallway, I heard Rebecca's voice one more time. "I can't marry someone who's ashamed of love, Michael. I won't become someone you'll eventually be embarrassed by, too." 3 weeks later, Mr. Henderson was discharged home with a clean bill of health and a new appreciation for life. Rebecca had broken her engagement to Michael the day after our confrontation, and she'd asked me to stay in touch, saying she wanted to learn more about the woman who'd raised such an accomplished son, even if he'd lost sight of how to value that gift. Michael called me 2 months after that, his voice humble in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child admitting to breaking something valuable. He asked if we could meet for coffee, if he could try to explain if there was any way to rebuild what he'd torn down. I agreed to meet him, not because I was ready to forgive or forget, but because I'd learned something important during those months of rebuilding my life. My worth wasn't determined by whether he valued me, but I could choose to value the love I'd given him regardless of whether it was returned. We met at a small cafe near the hospital, and for 2 hours we talked like mother and son for the first time in over a year. He apologized, really apologized, not the careful, lawyer-like statements he'd made in the hospital, but raw, honest admissions of how wrong he'd been. "I don't know if I can ever be the son you deserved," he said finally, tears in his eyes. "But I want to try. I want to remember how to be the person you raised me to be." I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand I'd held when he was scared, when he was hurt, when he was proud of some small accomplishment that seemed enormous to a child. "Michael," I said, "you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. You have to choose love over image, substance over status, character over convenience. The boy I raised is still in there somewhere. I saw him when you were crying in that hospital room. We didn't fix everything that day. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But we started the long work of finding our way back to each other, of remembering that family is about more than blood. It's about choosing to love someone even when they make it difficult." A year later, Michael met someone new, a teacher who loved his stories about his childhood, who asked to see pictures of his mother, who wanted to meet the woman who'd raised such a kind man, because that's what he'd become again, slowly and with effort. And I learned something that might be the most important lesson of my life. You can't control whether people appreciate your love, but you can control whether you let their failure to appreciate it diminish the love itself. The love I gave Michael was real and valuable and transformative, whether he recognized it or not. It made me who I was. And that woman, the woman who could save lives and offer comfort and choose grace even when it wasn't earned, was worth loving. Sometimes the greatest revenge is becoming so completely yourself that the people who rejected you realize what they lost. But even better than revenge is the peace that comes from knowing that your worth was never dependent on their recognition in the first place. I raised my son well. That he forgot that lesson for a while doesn't change the truth of it. And when he was ready to remember, I was still there, not because he deserved it, but because love, real love, doesn't keep score. That's what I want you to remember. If you're watching this and thinking about someone who's failed to appreciate your love, their blindness doesn't make your love less real, less valuable, or less worthy of celebration. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to make people see your worth and start living in a way that makes your worth undeniable. In the end, dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you give yourself. And once you claim it, no one can ever take it away again.